Welcome to Murray Montgomery's Talk Common Sense podcast. Remember, you can find the podcast on the Talk Common Sense Facebook page. Also find it on Spreaker, Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. See the Talk Common Sense videos on YouTube at M Images. And now, here's Murray.
Hey everybody, I'm glad to be back with you this evening. I was tied up over the Father's Day on Sunday, and I didn't get to make a podcast, which I always wanted to make about my dad because I loved him so much, and he gave me such a wonderful childhood and manhood, and he was a veteran. His name was Murray Montgomery Sr. He was born in 1920, and he passed away in 2008. He was a veteran of World War II. He was in combat in France, Germany, and Belgium. So that's just a little background on the man that I love and I'm so proud of. But I wanted to give you a little bit of my background with my dad and the funny things that happened along the way. I titled this podcast, Bubba's Butt's Been Busted. And the reason for that title is that's the attitude adjustment tool that my dad used on my butt when I got a little bit out of line. And he kept it on top of the refrigerator. And he had written on that paddle, Bubba's Butt's Been Busted. And he wasn't shy about showing that to anybody that came into the house. I remember when I took home my beautiful new bride, the first thing he did was drag that paddle off the top of the icebox, as we called it back then, and took it to her. She was nervous. She never had met these crazy people, and held it up in front of her and said, he ought to kiss this every day because this is the only reason that he graduated high school. Yeah, well, Daddy probably was right. But he didn't hesitate, like I said before, he didn't hesitate to embarrass. And some of the funny things I remember, I was the oldest, and while I was growing up, and even to this day, with some of my cousins, I was a Bubba. I was always called Bubba. Hence the name on the board, Bubba's Butt's Been Busted. But I had two little brothers and a little sister. And I was probably, 15, and my sister was probably, she was probably about 7, 8. Next brother was probably around 5 or 6, and the other one, the little one, was 4. Well, I created this club. It was a fictional club, and I called it the Tiger Club. Now, I don't know exactly what the Tiger Club was supposed to represent, other than it gave me total control over the little ones. Because if I told them they were not in the Tiger Club, they would go plumb berserk, start crying and screaming, and then Daddy had to come into play. So one day they was all sitting on the couch, lined up on the couch, and they didn't do exactly what I wanted to do, so I proceeded to tell them that they were no longer in the Tiger Club. And the yells and the screams went up. And Daddy grabbed me around the shoulders and he said, I am sick and tired of hearing this Tiger Club crap. Now, I don't want to hear no more about it, he said. So as we turned to walk away, I turned around and looked at them, and I gave them the thumbs up like, you're out. And then they all commenced to scream again. And here we went to the bathroom with the Bubba's Butt's Been Busted paddle, and he broke me over the bathtub like a shotgun, put my hands on the wall over the bathtub, and completely started to bust Bubba's butt. And that's exactly what he did. That was the funny things that went on all the time. And I guarantee you, when I had the Tiger Club, I had total control over them. But I better not let Daddy find out about it. And you know, some of the touching moments I think back on is when I got ready to go to boot camp, since I was going to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And I left the bus station there in Angleton, Texas, where I graduated high school. And Daddy took me to the bus station. And we were going to head out to Dallas, Texas. I was with the National Guard. And what they did, every little town, every place where the soldiers were coming from, they'd ride a bus to Dallas, and then the National Guard had chartered 3 buses to take us on to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. But as I was thinking about Dad the other day, I got to thinking about when he put me on that bus. And like myself, and I'm sure I probably got it from him, as being kind of emotional sometimes, and maybe for not any really bad reason. But as I got on that Greyhound bus and we pulled out of Angleton, I turned and looked back at him, and he had his head down and he had his handkerchief, and he was wiping tears from his eyes. Because you see, Daddy had been there. He had been there, and albeit I wasn't headed to combat, he had. And of course, when you're a soldier, you never know when you might be in combat. And I guess he was thinking back on those things, but I never will forget the sight of seeing him dab his eyes as we pulled away. You know, Daddy left Austin, Texas, where he was born, and the pay up there for a man that had just barely finished the 10th grade, if that much, the pay wasn't very good. And he saw an ad in the paper that they were hiring at Dow Chemical Company in Freeport, Texas. And they were interviewing people in Houston. Well, Daddy decided that he was going to try to get that good job and go to work at Dow. And so he hitchhiked from Austin, Texas to Houston with only 50 cents in his pocket. And I don't know what he did after he got to Houston, because I don't know if he knew anybody there. Perhaps he had an uncle there. I don't remember exactly. But he interviewed, and then I'm sure he hitchhiked all the way back to Austin. And lo and behold, he got that job. And it was just like a dream come true. You just can't imagine going from nothing to getting a great job at Dow Chemical. Great in the terms of money-wise, not great in the terms of working conditions. But he was so happy, and we all loaded up in the old car, and he got a trailer, a U-Haul trailer, and they rented that. And my Uncle Jimmy, my favorite uncle, Uncle Jimmy, and Aunt Fanny, they helped us move. And we moved down there, and Lake Jackson was a town that was actually built by Dow Chemical. And we lived in one of their company duplexes. And that's how it all started. And Daddy was making good money, and for back then. And I remember on paydays we would go out to the to the plant. They always paid on Thursday. Daddy would get his check, and there was a beer joint convenience store there in Freeport that it was called Bo Diddles. And they would cash those checks for those workers. And so we'd pull up there in our old car. I forget what it was, but I remember when we were kids sitting in the back seat, you could see the pavement through the holes in the floorboard. It's a wonder none of us ever fell out. But he'd get his check cashed, and the next item on the agenda was, let's go to the beach, Surfside Beach. And Mama would be protesting and all because she knew when Daddy got down there and got to drinking, let's spend the night. Well, all the kids were for that, but she sure as hell wasn't. But she put up with it, and we'd spend the night. And I'll never forget, before he moved down there, Daddy always wanted to live in the country. So he found a place out on the old Burnett Road north of Austin, which back then was nothing but cedar shakes, and now it's probably near being the downtown area. But back then it was in the country. So he moved us into an old rock house that was just loaded with scorpions, and rattlesnakes were everywhere, and there wasn't any screens on the windows, and there was no water wells. So we had to haul water from Austin, and the city had a water loading station there where you could pull up there with your pickup and drop a nozzle into your 55-gallon drum and fill it up, and then bring your water. Well, back in those days, Daddy liked to frequent the beer joints. And right down the road from our house on the Burnett Highway was an old beer joint. If best I remember, it was called Bernie's. And you could see Bernie's from our house. And so Mama would be sitting at home there with us kids. I don't think there were but 3 of us at the time. I don't think the little one had been born yet, because he was only one of the bunch that was born in Freeport. The rest of us were born in Austin. But Mama could look out the front window and she could see Daddy's old truck parked in the parking lot of Bernie's with that 55-gallon drum of water on the back. And we're out of water at the house, so she can't bathe the kids, she can't do nothing. Well, that was the last straw. That was the last straw. That broke the camel's back, so to speak. And Daddy's living in the country days were over, because just as soon as she could find a way into Austin, and albeit she didn't have a dime to her name, she finagled a way to rent a house. And she told him, either you can come with us or you could stay here, but me and the kids are moving to town. And that's what happened. You know, those memories, you think back on them, and those were rough times. They really were. And Daddy was young and full of piss and vinegar, you might say, and he liked to drink his old cold pearl beer. And he straightened out as the years passed, but that was the early days. You know, Daddy, he never had a hobby. He never taught me how to hunt, how to fish. You know, I learned that through friends and other dads, but Daddy's hobby was his family. He loved his family. And his greatest weekend and days off was to be in the backyard when we lived there in Angleton, Texas. To be in the backyard barbecuing and drinking pearl beer and having his family. And that's all he needed. He didn't need anything else. No, Daddy was the kind of person that everybody that met him loved him. And he couldn't be a racist back then. He tried to be one, but he just couldn't do it. And his best friend was a black guy that ran a filling station there in Angleton, Daddy had a shop out in the back of the house after he retired from Dow. He had him a little business making rubber stamps. And this black fella, he would come to the house, and him and Daddy would sit out in Daddy's shop and drink beer. So Daddy's days of being a racist didn't last long at all. In fact, he told me one time, he said, when you were first born, he said, the first person to kiss you on your forehead that wasn't family was a black man. So no, Daddy couldn't be a racist. Now, he wouldn't have cared much for BLM and some of the crap that's going on today. He wouldn't have cared for that. Daddy always told me, he said, you treat people with respect, regardless of their color. You treat them with respect, but you also expect them to treat you with respect. And I've tried my best to live by that saying. All those long days ago that were given to me by my daddy. Daddy loved little kids up until the day he passed away. His grandkids and his great grandkids. If a little kid was there, say a little 3 or 4 year old, even a baby, he would always reach down and he would cup their face in his hands and just stare into their eyes and then kiss them on the forehead. I've seen him do that 1,000,000 times. But he loved little children. And he loved to mess with little children too. he loved to mess with them. I remember my brother's kids, they was all up on these movies, Star Wars. So when we first went to the moon, Daddy was all into that. Well, my brother Richard's kids would come home and they would be telling him about the trip to the moon. And he'd act like he had never seen it and like he didn't know nothing about it. And they'd say, well, Pawpaw, he said, we went to the moon. And Daddy would say, oh, hell, I don't like that old Star Wars crap. And they'd say, no, Daddy, no, Pawpaw, we went to the moon. Oh, I don't care nothing about that old Star Wars crap. And all he was doing was just trying to get a rise out of them. And he was good at that. And I remember, too, about how Daddy would defend his family. You know, Daddy was not a great communicator with his kids. And sadly, I think I've turned out the same way. But what Daddy would do, he would brag about his kids to other people. But he never would brag about his kids to their face. Not till he got older, and then he did. But I followed that trait, and I'm sorry for it. That was probably one trait I don't like. But he loved his kids, and he loved them forever. And he would brag on them, but he wouldn't brag on them, while they were listening. I don't know why, because I remember telling, later I went to work for Dow Chemical, and I remember telling a friend of mine that, yeah, Daddy never did brag about me. And that friend, he worked with Daddy, and he said, boy, you nuts. When he's here at work, he said, you're all he talks about, and how proud he is of you. Ain't that odd? But that's the way it was, and that's the way he was. I remember when I got married to my first wife, was a high school sweetheart, which was a mistake. But I was one of these people that back then, I didn't want to be given things like I would always consider charity, which it wasn't given in that way. But when me and that girl first got married, well, we lived right next door to her parents, which is another mistake. And they had given us furniture and all kind of stuff, but they were always in our business, And I finally told her, I said, I'm not putting up with this crap. I said, we're going to move. And I told her kind of like Mama told Daddy about moving to town. I told her, I said, we're going to move. You can come with me or not, you know. Well, her old daddy, he kind of got belligerent, you know, like he was trying to threaten me, which I certainly wasn't afraid of him. But the reason I'm talking about this is because Daddy found out about it, and before I knew about it, he was over there and right up in that old man's face. So he was always a protector of his family. Always. You know, he might talk bad about his kids if they did something wrong, but nobody else was going to talk bad about them, not in front of him or Mama either. That's just the way they roll. But I remember I used to get so damn mad at Daddy. He had this way at he always had chores for you. And I always dreaded when he was off on the weekends, and you didn't sleep late when Daddy was off. And he'd always come in there and he'd be rattling my bed and he'd say, come on, boy, I got some tricks for you. Well, tricks meant chores. You know, he either wanted you to mow the grass or get out there and dig in the garden or do something. But that just irritated the hell out of me when I was a teenager when he said, I got some tricks for you. And, you know, you get away from me and you say, boy, when I get big, I'm going to have some tricks for you. No way in hell. He was a little man, and I towered over him when I was a teenager. But he always told me. What he did, he put the fear of God in me. He said, boy, if you ever think that you're big enough to whip me, he said, you're going to be in for some bad hurt. And he even told me, he said, I'll get a 2x4 and I'll hide it behind the door and I'll knock you in the head when you come in the house. And he didn't mean a word of that, but he damn sure made me believe it. And I never drew back my fist at him in any way, shape, or form. But that was my daddy. That was my daddy. And I loved him to death. And I still think about him. I think about him often. And it was so funny when we were living in those government apartments down in Lake Jackson, Texas. Well, I was probably about 15 years old. And the mosquitoes were so bad, and Daddy had to work shift work, and there wasn't any air conditioning back then. And that little town of Lake Jackson, you might say, was built in a damn swamp. And so the mosquitoes were everywhere, and he'd be working the night shift, and he'd have to try to sleep in the daytime, and there wasn't any air conditioning, and the only circulation of air we had in that duplex was they had a big old attic fan, they call it. And that son of a gun looked like the props off of a B-17 bomber. And when you cranked that baby up and had it on reverse, it'd suck everything in from the outside. And that's how Daddy would sleep. He'd have to sleep with that attic fan crack the window and sucking air in from the inside. But I never will forget, how bad those mosquitoes were, that they would bring a DDT truck around every day or so, and it'd be fogging out that DDT. And the kids, we loved those DDT trucks. We'd run behind them, smelling that DDT, and it smelled so good. And my daddy would say, open up the house, open up all the windows and let this attic fan suck that DDT into the house, kill these mosquitoes. Oh, you knew that DDT just had to be good for you. I don't know. We must have been a tougher bunch back then, or nobody told us that DDT would kill us. Those were the good times. And I thank God that I was able to have my childhood during that time. But I wouldn't take nothing for it. We didn't have much money, but we never went without food. We never went out without a roof over our head, and that was because of my daddy and my mother. I always said if I could just be half the man he was, that I'd be satisfied in life. And you know, as he got on up in age, he always wanted, as I said before, he always wanted to live in the country. Well, when he got in his late 50s, he was finally able, him and Mom, more or less against her wishes, because she was happy to be living in Lake Jackson, and she had a real good job. She was an insurance broker and a real estate agent, but he just kept after. We got to move to the country. So he finally kept after. She finally gave in, and they bought a place in Lavaca County near Vienna, Texas. I think it was around 5 acres or so. And he was a happy man. And they finally were able, they sold their house in Lake Jackson, and they built a home right there near Vienna. And then after they got on up in years and older, well, they moved into Hallettsville, and they bought them a house in Hallettsville, Texas, and that's where they lived until they both passed. And I know some people probably be bored hearing about somebody talk about their childhood. But I'll tell you this, if your parents are still with you, cherish them. And if your grandparents are with you, cherish them. And don't let their stories go untold. Chances are that 9 times out of 10, they're good people. And their stories need to be told. I find myself now sometimes wishing that Mom and Dad were here where I could ask them questions. Because there's things that, happening in the history of your family, and nobody could answer those questions but those folks, and they're gone. So, I hope I haven't bored you too much talking about my daddy, but I enjoy talking about him. I enjoy sharing these memories, and like I said before, I wish he was still here, him and Mom, where I could talk to him. But that's the way life is, and we all have to experience it. We experience the good times and we experience the bad times. So I'm going to leave you now, folks, and God bless all you fathers and mothers out there, and think about your folks. Think about your folks and all the things that they've done for you. And that's all for now, friends. Good night, and I'll see you on down the road.